Well, I am very happy to welcome everyone. I'm Sandra Lubarski, and I'm the president of Flagstaff College. And it's a delight to have you here, especially I know um, how how crowded your lives are at this time of the year. And this is, as you know, the 3.5% project. This is the final event in our current round of the 3.5% project. And this round was focused on economics and the intersection of economics and climate disruption. And our hope as a college is to promote education that is genuinely community-based. And it's really focused on the most pressing problems that we're facing as a civilization and as a community. And we hope to continue these conversations in the year to come, and hope that you'll join us for more of these discussions so that we can all figure out how to be more responsive to these kinds of issues and how to really deepen our democratic process and in creative and thoughtful ways. We're happy, I always want to mention that we're very happy to have the support of the Center for Process Studies, which promotes planetary flourishing based on a process relational understanding of reality. And that is an approach that we share with the center. I am going to just say again how grateful we are that you're with us in this project, and we look forward to the next year of events with you. And I am now going to turn it over to Mark to introduce our wonderful speaker for tonight.
So economics, as you know, is sometimes called the dismal science. And I think that's largely because it begins with the assumption that we're all individuals competing with each other to become wealthy. And if that's your starting point, if we're all in competition with each other and there are finite resources and services, then of course there's going to be at least a few people whose lives are dismal, and maybe the vast majority of people. Our speaker tonight, Mark Anielski, is an expert in another type of economics, the economics of happiness or the economics of well-being. If you begin with the assumption that our lives are interconnected, that we are individuals in community with other individuals, and that our human communities are enmeshed in the community of the natural world, and if you assume that the purpose of economics is to increase the well-being of everyone, then economics, rather than being the dismal science, has the potential to be the happy science. Mark is the president and chief well-being officer at Anielski Management. He's the author of The Economy of Well-Being and the Economics of Happiness, and a former professor of management at the University of Alberta. He's consulted with a wide range of clients, including nations, notably China, large cities, including Edmonton, Alberta, where he lives, and where it's currently 30 degrees below zero, and businesses and First Nations in Canada. John Cobb, who in my estimation is almost always right, has said of Mark Anielski that he is leading the way to a new understanding of economics. Mark, it's a real pleasure to have you with us tonight, and we look forward to learning from you.
Well, thanks. Thanks for having me in your living room and your heads and your hearts, I hope. Thanks, Sandra, and thanks, Marcus. Yeah, it's a brisk minus 32, I think, centigrade here. So, but keeps us humble. That's why we like hockey. So, but you know, I just realized. Thanks, Marcus. You posted the passing of my mentor Herman Daly. Both Herman Daly and John Cobb Jr. have been my mentors for about 20 some years now. So it's sad to have the father of ecological economics passing, and you know, he really should have won the Nobel Prize in economics, but that's a whole other story because the banks finance the Nobel Prize in economics. People don't know that. It's not the Nobel Committee. So that says a lot about economics. So I'm gonna just present my kind of vision. I call it the, building an economy of well-being and enduring happiness. And my whole inquiry into this field, I started actually with articling with as an accountant with what was now PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, when I was 21. And I realized that auditing was so boring and I loved the outdoors. So I went back to university and did a forestry degree, and then joined the Alberta government in the land use planning area. For 13 years, I was a forest economist. And that meant that I was tasked with trying to value non-market values, recreation, wildlife, and integrate those non-market values into the land use planning for Alberta. And in those years, the 13 years I was government, I then moved over to finance ministry or treasury. And that's when I read a paper called the Genuine Progress Indicator, or GPI, which John Cobb's son, Cliff Cobb, had actually helped architect. And it was Herman Daly and John Cobb who had come up with this idea of an index for sustainable economic welfare. And when I read that report, I was in my 30s, and I thought, I'm going to do this work one day. This is the future. We need, because sitting in finance, I realized, and we were sitting in Treasury Board as economists and developing the government's business plan and accountability systems, that we were not, in fact, as Robert Kennedy said, measuring the things that make life worthwhile. So why were we so obsessed with GDP growth? And that obsession's only been around since World War II. GDP didn't exist prior to World War II. And it was then that I got hired by Redefining Progress in San Francisco. They wanted to hire me, and I said, we can't. My wife said, we can't move there. We can't afford to live there. They can't even, and as Canadians, of course, we have like spectacular healthcare. So they couldn't pay me enough to move to San Francisco. But in the end, so I went back to my consulting work, and they ended up hiring me anyways, because they said, we can't do this work. We can't replicate what Cliff Cobb did. So could you do it? So it was then that I went and visited Herman at University of Maryland, where he taught. And what an amazing man. And, he said something really important to me, and this is always the crux of my presentations, which is, we have to understand the nature of money itself and so it's not, in my opinion, it's not all the things we think are at fault with the economy or with climate change. It's the nature of money and how it's created. That's the problem. And Herman said to me, this inquiry into the relationship between money creation and economic growth, GDP, is going to be the most important thing you do in your career. And so it's my passion. I'm zealous about the notion of reestablishing a monetary system where well-being and happiness are linked directly to the creation of money itself. And I'm a Canadian, so I had to go back and reread Jefferson and Lincoln and Franklin to discover you guys are really messed things up in 1913 with the Federal Reserve, and we've lost our way. And John Maynard Keynes said in 1930, wrote an amazing letter. It's called Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. And he said, we will have to wait another 100 years to deal with the misdemeanor we call usury. So here we are closing on 2030, and we still haven't grown up, and we're in a serious international debt crisis, to say the least, let alone climate change. So that's a bit of context, what motivates me. So in 1999, I left the Alberta government and I became a consultant, and I taught at the University of Alberta. I taught corporate ethics, actually, or corporate social responsibility. And I also was asked by Gifford Pinchot and Liva Pinchot to help co-found the Bainbridge Graduate Institute on Bainbridge Island, in Seattle area. And I was blown away because Gifford Pinchot's grandfather was the founder of the U.S. Forest Service, right? And so I was like, what the heck? I'm with royalty here. And they said, no, we want you to come here and teach economics. And so it was spectacular. And the modality of teaching, as you would know with Flagstaff, was learning in circles. I'm not the guru. I'm not, we didn't have desks. We sat in a circle. We knew that we were each other's teachers, right? And so it was a spectacular experiment in a new form of education. And it's there that my students said, Mark, you're blowing our minds. You taught us about how the money system works, and then you're proposing this new economy, which is based on well-being. And it was then that they said, you have to write a book. I said, I don't want to write a book. I just want to talk about this stuff. I'm a pragmatist. I want to run treasuries and, civil governance that are oriented towards well-being. But anyways, I did manage to write this book in 2007, just before the crash. And people thought I was, I had predicted the crash. And I said, I didn't predict the crash, but I knew it was going to happen. And nothing's changed since 2008. But so in that book, what was my whole journey then became an inquiry into the language of economics and business. And so I'll just throw a bunch of these words at you. Like when we say economy, well, so my favorite online site is the Etymological Online Dictionary. So you go and look at economy, Greek for oikos, nomia. Oikos means household, nomia means management, stewardship. Ecology, the knowledge of the household, oikos logia. Competition in Latin, competere, to strive together. Education in Latin, educare, meaning to draw forth what's already within. Happiness, eudaimonia, the well-being of your soul, well-being of spirit. So, okay, we're going to put Humpty back together again. Economics is not a dismal science. We're all economists. We're all trying to manage households and businesses. Are we striving together, or are we trying to beat each other up in a kind of self-centered narcissistic system in which everyone loses, and certainly nature loses? And so my favorite words was the word wealth, and it comes from the Old English, 13th century Old English, meaning the conditions of well-being. Wella means well-being, and th letters mean the condition of something. So guess what? Health and wealth are cousins. And then I added the word genuine, because genuine is a tough word because it means to be aligned with your values. What's value? Well, value in Latin is to be worthy or strong, valorum. So now we've got this whole architecture, a foundation that is connected to the foundations of accounting, going back 500 years to Venice, to Luca Pacioli and Leonardo da Vinci, who said, all wealth comes from God. Oh, okay, that's a primary truth. Debits must equal credit, because as in nature, so in accounting. What is an asset? Well, an asset is something that delivers future utility. Well, what's a util? What's utility? Well, what if util is a unit of well-being? How do we measure well-being? How do we build budgets around well-being? So in that, so now I'm imagining, and I pitched this to Redefining Progress at the time. I said, it's fine to have an alternative index, but all you're doing is you're playing into the Hegelian dialectic. GDP is bad, GPI is good. No, what's flawed is the accounting system. What's flawed is nations are operating without a balance sheet. We are not measuring the assets, the integrity of the forests or the wetlands or the watersheds in Arizona and Alberta. So you can't run a country, you can't run a business without certain assets not counted. So Robert Kennedy was right. We're not measuring the things that make life worthwhile. So, okay, so how are we going to measure well-being? Well, I'm not a psychologist, but sociologists, psychologists have looked into this. Well, what's the secret recipe? What's the algorithm for well-being? Well, they say there's certain things that are critical to well-being: the quality of your upbringing, less than genetics, actually, the conditions and the environment in which you grew up. And only 10% is how much you make and how much education you have. But the best news is 40% is about relationships with each other. And I work with Native Canadians, Indigenous people, and for them, their whole modality, the worldview is relationships, all my relations. in our worldview, it's like, no, like winner takes all. Like, if I succeed financially, I'm the king of the heap, and a kind of narcissistic system, if not psychopathic, right? So we have to face that music and say, all right, if so, what the best I can hope for is creating an awareness of that this language has not lost its meaning. It still resonates with truth. So we would go back to our city councils or our premier or governors or whatever. We're like, no, we're speaking this ancient still language that still speaks about well-being. And you say, well, what do you want us to do? You want us to measure well-being? How? I said, well, well-being is an attribute of an asset. So it could be a house, it could be a car, it could be a wetland. What are those attributes that anyone looking at those kind of natural systems would look for? So we have indicators, proxies of the asset. We also have proxies of the risks to the assets. What's the liability? Because that's part of the balance sheet, right? And so I'm just talking conventional language here. This is not revolutionary. I'm not for or against anything. I'm not Republican. I don't care about ideology. I'm just talking about the tools we've been using. But there's a key piece missing on the well-being side, which is how we feel, our emotions. And so I'm giving a great deal of, because economists love to, like, we believe we can measure everything, but we're not measuring how we feel about our mental or physical and emotional and spiritual well-being, which is actually the foundation of what Abraham Maslow developed, the hierarchy of needs. He got that concept for the Blackfoot in southern Alberta. And they talked about the medicine wheel, and he turned the medicine wheel into a pyramid. So it's, self-actualization is not the top of the heap. It's only part of your wheel of life. So if we then go, okay, well, how are we going to ask questions about your mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being? What questions would we ask citizens? So these are the kind of surveys that I started to construct, and had a good fortune of running this well-being survey that I call the soul print of well-being, for lack of creative words, across all of Ireland in 2021 during COVID, sponsored by the biggest digital media outlet in Ireland. And they said, could you do the North too? I'm like, sure, let's run the whole survey in both the Republic and Northern Ireland. And I was stunned, because we asked questions like, how do you feel? How much joy do you feel in your soul? How do you trust, do you trust your neighbors? Do you trust your politicians? How do you sleep at night? Do you feel a sense of belonging to your neighborhood in spite of your religion, your gender, your race, right? And the results were absolutely stunning. There was pretty much uniform well-being, subjective well-being across every county in Ireland. And the North was actually slightly happier than the South. And it just blew my mind that this is Irish people who we think are always at each other's throat. And they're saying, no, we actually get along, And I said, well, why don't we just hand this to the Irish governments, and they say, look, the people spoke, right? We asked them questions about their lives. Nobody ever asked you how much joy do you feel in your life, or how much love do you have for your neighbor. I said, well, why don't we ask those questions and then respect the response? And then we can map well-being at the neighborhood level in Flagstaff, at the zip code level. You could every fall, you could have a survey and ask citizens how they feel. I could show you where despair is and where loneliness is, where it lives, right? Or why some communities are actually measurably happier. And it's not about how much money they make so much, it's the level of trust they have across the fence, right? So these are the kind of practical things I bring to governments, or try to. And it's not always easy, because people think I'm either a nutcase or revolutionary. I'm not a revolutionary economist. I'm a conventional accounting, economic guy that has a passion for good governance. So, and the last thing I'll say is, so now I find myself working exclusively with my Indigenous brothers and sisters because they were here first. We came here with our flags and our systems and our British laws. There was 100 million of them before we brought our smallpox and decimated their matrilineal structures. Like, we almost wiped them right out. And they're teaching us again how to live in harmony with the land, to use wampum and seashells for money, like the Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee did in the Iroquois Confederacy, which of course Benjamin Franklin studied. And I'm getting even more strident saying, I took the Declaration of Independence during COVID and I said, what if I put the word love in there? What if we're added love to the highest conscious document in the United States? And just spoke it out and see how people feel. Would they elect me for president? I think so. And we got nothing to lose because we're at an important and exciting tipping point where we can restore this dismal science to what it always, I think, aspired to, what Aristotle said about economics. So I'll stop talking because everything else about the details are like, well, how do you do this? And what are the risks? And what will the politicians say? And who will complain and who will throw you off the bus? And it's like, I don't work for anybody. I could say irreverent things. I keep getting invited by people to say, come inspire us. But it's just a practical, I think it's a practical thing to, and I say, how could selling well-being and happiness be so different? I want a well-being party. I don't care about Republicans and libertarians and Democrats. I just don't care. I just want a well-being party. Anyways, I'll stop talking.
I get to ask the first question. I just want to say, I love the idea of doing these neighborhood surveys because, we in Flagstaff that I know you've been through here a couple of times and stuff. I mean, there are areas where the wealthy people live and poor people live, and people say, "Oh, we need to develop this neighborhood, and we need to, this side needs this and something." But there's never, as far as I know, been any survey of the kind you're talking about, and it might be that the poorer neighborhoods are happier than the richer ones or something. I mean, we just don't have any, as far as I know, we don't have any data on that.
Right.
And it would be helpful just to see what people think. And, do you include things like what would make you happier? Or, I mean, or do you have to what else is on these surveys?
So in the survey, which in my surveys, by the way, it's free online. I've had, I use the same survey for all my client work, all the, and so I've got like 3,500 respondents to the survey. So I've got some big data going on now. Over the last 2 or 3 years, I've been using the survey tool. And so the survey only takes about 7 minutes to complete. But there's 2 open-ended questions at the front end. What do you love about where you live? Which is the biggest question of all, because if you didn't love where you live, you'd move, right? So what is it that you love about where you live? And what would you like to change? Not just about your community, but your personal life. So I've got maybe 3 open-ended questions. Then I asked the John McKnight, Peter Block questions on abundant communities. What are the gifts that other people say you have? What's unique about Marcus beyond your degrees and what you've done for money or professionally? Oh, you're a good listener. You're empathetic. You're a good account. I don't know, you like numbers or something, anyways, they're
I'm not commenting. Go ahead.
You like to sing in choirs, whatever. And so I think, and I know John McKnight and Walter Brueggemann and Peter Block. I've had the joy of sitting with them and thinking about, well, how do we bring this community asset-based accounting to our cities, right? And we've tried it here in Edmonton. It's had some success, but it's still not getting the traction in terms of budgeting in terms of, okay, are we really going to empower neighborhoods? Right? Should autonomy live in neighborhoods? Should, how far should governments step into our happiness, our lives, right? Or are we each other's keeper? Do we relearn how to share in the abundance that is the reality, right? And the abundance of the gifts that we have. So it gets interesting, to say the least, to say, well, how are these ideas like McKnight's really adopted, right? But the subjective piece, I find, I'm not saying we need to survey every year, but what if we, instead of just doing normal census questions, we just had a census here. Canada's a census, you guys have census, we have every 5 years. I said to the finance minister, why don't you add some subjective questions to the census? It's not going to add, I think we'd all smile if we were asked how much joy do you have in your life, like, but the responses, I think, are interesting, meaningful, and will tell us something about just how maybe universal life satisfaction is across the country. Again, and I find there's hardly, that income doesn't actually matter. I mean, yes, if you're living in abject poverty,
Right.
your life satisfaction is low, right? That's just a no-brainer. But if some economists say if $75,000 household is a sufficient level of household income for a statistically valid level of happiness, then my only question is, what's the distribution of income by household in Flagstaff? How many people are living below living wage? Because I bet you when I do a survey, I will find low levels of life satisfaction, right?
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, let me throw it open to other people to ask their questions. Eva is a former city council member and very much involved in local politics, including a bill to raise the minimum wage here, which passed several times. And we lead the state in the minimum wage. But other people, other questions?
Mark, this is Sandra, and I actually would love to have you get into the weeds on how you have conversations with with elected officials and with city planners and professionals. So you take this data, you've got this information about well-being and about what really matters. Have you had experience then working with cities to actually integrate that data into the way they do their planning or their budgeting?
Sandra, I wish I'd say my success. I have a really good batting average, but here's what typically happens. Like, oh, Mark, this is great. We should integrate. Edmonton hired me and said, yeah, we have a 10-year strategic plan, and can you do the GPI for Edmonton, the chief economist of the city? And I did. We did the work, and it was around for 5 or more years, right? But it wasn't really fully, it was just like, okay, these are indicators. Economists are still tracking inflation and all the normal employment, that's conventional. But, we never ran the subjective well-being survey. So we were just doing GPI, just, these other proxy indicators that we think are proxies of well-being. But my aspiration is I want to integrate this into the capital and operating budget process, because I want to know when you have an affordable housing program or you have an end poverty initiative, that I believe you can verify the well-being ROI on those initiatives. And what does that mean? I actually think about what questions I would ask of the beneficiaries of the program or policy at the front end of the initiative. So I have a baseline of well-being. And I have done that successfully. I've done it on affordable housing programs in Edmonton. Say, of the tenants that live in the, low rental housing, it'll be conditioned on their rental renewal to fill out the survey. And what do we get? We get unbelievable well-being statistics by building, by ethnic, by language group, Somalian, whatever, right? Syrian. And why is that important? Because I want to know where well-being is highest and why it's highest in this building versus that building. What is it about the community? So now I can actually literally calculate what I call a well-being ROI, because it's a subjective proxy, and I can match that with cost benefit analysis, etc. So yes, I have been successful in that regard. With First Nations here, I've been very successful at, they get it, like it's just common sense, like, oh yeah, we think that way. We, well-being is like innate to us. In the Cree language, we cheat to win, a circle of shared responsibility. Wakotowin, meaning, all my relations in Cree, right? So see, the language is already there. So when I try to then bring well-being survey data into the weekly chief and council meetings, they say, so tell me, Mark, from your pivot table, how do youth feel about, anxiety, which is a proxy for suicide ideation or something, who knows, right? It's like, well, I could say this, the youth in this, the 12 to 14-year-olds are feeling this way, and the girls versus the boy, should we get a police dog for our community? Well, let's think about that. We'll do a cost benefit, and we'll look at the statistics on how people feel safe, personal safety, walking alone at night, right? So now we start to, okay, and all we do is we keep going back to that data set, and it's a big elaborate pivot table, which might make some people blind, but me, I'm like, no, it's live. I can query this anytime. What question you want to ask of the data that may inform this policy decision? So that to me that's exciting. So it is working in some areas, but not to the big cities. Like my own city, I haven't been invited back. I've tried, because for some it's like scary. It's like, no, we got elected on our platform or whatever. It's like, well, all right, fair enough. But in our city, in Edmonton, we have community leagues. We have 155 community leagues, and I was the treasurer of my community league. There's 9,200 residents in my neighborhood, and to think that we could use the survey data to speak with a voice at city council it's just not going to happen, because we have no power, even though we're the largest community in Edmonton. Anyways, those are just practical political realities, right? So yeah, so I am sometimes I'm like, oh, we haven't made much progress, but actually we have made a lot of progress, and John McKnight's thrilled because we've adopted his community asset mapping work.
Mark, I'm not sure a lot of people know who John McKnight, know his work here. So can you just quickly summarize his
so John McKnight is, I think, what is he, 92 years old now? Anyway, I don't know if you know who Walter Brueggemann is, the Old Testament scholar. So John McKnight and Peter Block wrote the Abundant Community book. John McKnight was JFK's director of affirmative action program. It was crazy. Like, guy's been around for a while, and he taught in Chicago for many years, and he basically argued that communities are full of assets. We are full of gifts and talents and things and abilities, and if we and the notion that we can share in these assets, can share the ladder, the lawnmower, right, will build relationships of trust, right? So this was his work, and Peter Block was a consultant, wrote the book, I think, The Art of Consulting. They teamed up and wrote this amazing book, right? So again, and they're in Cincinnati. They've been working in Cincinnati and trying to advance their community asset. It's called ABCD platform. So,
and if I just want to let people in Flagstaff know that we do have that asset program was integrated here a number of years ago, and those mountain lions that you see outside of the grade school and various places in town, that was an asset building project that was undertaken. But it is
Wonderful.
really important work because it turns the whole method from what's wrong with this community to what's good about it. Where's the power in it?
What's
And I
good,
just
yeah.
think the work that you're doing is such an important complement to that work.
Yeah. So what I've done is I've combined those questions that McKnight asks about, personal gifts and with these subjective well-being questions from the science of well-being. So you've got the strength of both of those data sets, really.
Great. We have a couple of questions. I'm gonna let's see. We'll start with Eva, and then Christine has a question, and Mark Sorensen also. So Eva, go ahead.
Hi, Mark. So you have a big data set. Where did you find correlation between well-being and what characteristics or what experiences kind of in general across the data sets?
Well, that's a great question. I had a South African statistician friend look at the 3,200 responses to the survey over about 2.5 years. And this is around across the world. I've done work in Tahiti and like Singapore, right? Ireland, of course. And he said, I have 36 questions in my survey. And so he looked at the whole, the whole multiclinary, all that stuff. And he said, what's remarkable is of the 36 questions, there's 23 or 24 that stand alone. They're statistically discrete. That means what? It's like, that's interesting because then that means I have 23 discrete variables that define well-being of a person, right? Again, and I use the 4 domains: mental, physical, emotional, spiritual. That's pretty cool. But I'm not a statistician, so I haven't really delved much further into. I've run this just general correlation between taking the life satisfaction question, which is the same question that Gallup asks in the World Happiness Poll every year, and said, well, which of the other responses correlates statistically, to that response. And the interesting thing is, it verifies that money is not, like income is not as highly correlated. Ask a question, do you feel you make enough income to meet your needs? That's the question I ask, right? Do you feel your income meets your needs? And then I also ask them their income at the end if they want to tell me their income. So, but I haven't really delved into what the data is telling me, except that the highest correlation to life satisfaction is self-rated joy. And then belonging. So that the highest scoring indicator for Ireland was not life satisfaction. All my indicators are 1 to 10. The response where 10 is always like awesome, right? But the highest average score was to the question of feeling of belonging in your neighborhood in spite of religion, right? That was amazing to me. So, yeah, so there's a lot more interesting analysis that can be done with the data set. And again, I'm not Dean, or I'm not none of these people that studies this stuff professionally. I'm just curious about. Now, of course, I'm very curious about how well-being correlates with things like ecological footprint, which I also do, right? And there's questions about how you feel about the environment. I don't ask any opinion questions. I don't ask you what you think about climate change. I ask you what's your relationship with nature, right? Things like that. So, and again, what's cool is I have a theory that if you can geospatially locate well-being on the landscape, you get some interesting observations too.
Actually, that's perfect segue to Christine Crandall. Are you with us? And do you want to go ahead and ask your question about non-market values around the environment?
Sure. Yeah, I was just curious. I think actually, Mark, you just indicated that it's kind of embedded in your questions, that connection. But I'm just wondering too how you bring that forward. those do stand out, to present those to decision makers, leaders, that can maybe shape some of these, conservation approaches that we desperately are in need of.
Yeah. No, well, as an ecological economist, I would say the nature questions, the environment questions are the hardest ones to construct, because I don't know, I don't want to get into again, what you think about climate change. I want to know how you relate to nature. And of course, we recreate ourselves with recreation, right? We find recreation in nature. So, that's where we go to renew ourselves. So, but there's some interesting questions. For example, for the real estate industry, does location matter? Does, location closer to green space affect well-being, right? How do we measure that? So those are, can you tie, particular matter, whatever pollution release numbers to well-being? Probably, certainly with ecological footprint, but ecological footprint is just based on consumptions, but how much you spend. So, anyways, that's an area I think of further inquiry and complexity. So.
Okay, I'm going to go to Mark Sorensen. Mark asked a question about children. Mark, you want to frame it for us?
Yeah, thank you so much for the inspiring ideas. Yeah, the question I have is, were children or youth involved in the surveys you did in Ireland?
Not in Ireland. The cutoff was, I think, 15 years of age. So we had some teenagers. I have also developed a children's survey, shorter, from 10 to, my favorite kids are 11-year-olds, because there's a theory there that there's a tipping point happens that we actually come out of our childhood around 7 or 8 years of age. So what questions would you ask of a 7 or 8-year-old? Right. I can ask them. And sometimes I just ask the kids to write a story about what makes them happy. Right. And of course, every kid has an amazing story. So what I would do in my first project with the city of Leduc, just south of Edmonton here, and all the grade 6 students had to fill out my survey, partly because part of their class was going to City Hall and learning about politics, right? So I got a perfect sample, right? But the results, and it was funny because mayor and council, they didn't care about what the adults said. We want to see the kids' survey results, right?
Exactly.
The stories were hilarious. Like one of my favorites is this kid says, my mom and I moved. My mom's a single mom, and we moved to Leduc, and we live in the trailer park. And at school, I get bullied, and they'd say you're just trailer trash and da da da. But then one day we got invited to a potluck, and this is the best community ever, right? So I was just like, it brought tears to your eyes. Like, what? This story about single mom who's overstudy because she's poor, and her son says, this is a welcoming community. And so anyways, I love the kids survey stuff. It's
great.
Boy, there's so much important information that you're gathering with these surveys about how we can actually do this stuff in our communities.
And my point is, we're just asking about our emotions and perception. Isn't perception reality? We talk that way, but we don't honor it. And we think that physical, standard objective statistics tell us everything. Well, they can't. So what I do, and this is a really key point, when I construct my accounts, my well-being accounts, and I love spreadsheets. So I've got all of this, primary asset accounts, 33 sub-asset accounts. We have people, right? And then you have health, and then you have psychological well-being, mental well-being, sub-asset accounts. So so the one column is just standard conventional statistics, suicide rate, whatever, right? and life expectancy. And the other column is the subjective mirror or a subjective proxy for that particular attribute.
Mm.
So crime rates, do I feel safe walking alone at night? You know, side by side, then by neighborhood, right?
So let me ask you again, and then I know there's other questions out there. When you bring this forward to the elected officials and the planners, I mean, again, this just seems like such useful information.
I know. It is useful. I'm like, look, I think, first of all, it's an omnibus survey. It should apply to every department, you know, transportation, you know, I would say the engineers should be able to demonstrate why widening a lane, putting another lane will improve well-being or safety, right? Don't we expect that of engineers? Oh, no, that's not, oh, whatever. But, you know, I think the hardest part is, and I say, where should this live in the C-suite? You know, should it be with the chief financial officer, the city manager's office? But because it's an omnibus, it's an integrated accounting system that every department should see themselves in these accounts and pull whatever they find meaningful for their programs. But that's a challenge because you got social services, they're doing family social services, they're doing needs assessment. Well, we've always done needs assessment this way. It's like, well, this is a broad assessment of well-being, and you will certainly see the need show up in the survey results. But you could actually probably reduce the cost of data gathering just with this one instrument. So
Can you just like one of the big issues in Flagstaff is affordable housing and also the housing of homeless people.
yeah.
And so do you have a data set that would be helpful then as our city is grappling with solutions around affordable housing?
Yeah. I mean, I've studied, one of my favorite programs is Habitat for Humanity. And why? You know, in Cincinnati, for example, a third of the housing stock was boarded up. And so I met a young minister, Methodist minister, Thomas, who had was a prison warden in New Orleans and then studied Habitat. And he said, come see what I'm doing. I said, what do you, he said, I'm solving poverty. It's like, how? He says, well, these houses, Cincinnati, the city can't even afford to bulldoze them. They're the good German built houses from the 1890s. And I go in and I look at it and say, I can restore this house. I could buy it for $1,000 from the city. I can restore it for $40,000. I could put a family, African-American family, low income, never afford a mortgage, into a $700 a month interest-free mortgage. And they're debt-free in 10 years. I'm like, hallelujah. Let's scale this. Let's take this to every city across the United States. And that's what Habitat does, interest-free mortgages. How did they do that? Well, I've studied it forensically. And guess what? Those folks that I surveyed when I did a well-being survey of affordable housing programs across Alberta, was the Habitat people were the happiest. And then we went to interview them. They were like, we'll tell you why we're happy. You know, we don't just are given a key and low rent. We have it. I said, you don't even appreciate the fact that you're saving yourself between $9,000 and $10,000 a year in avoided interest costs on what would be a conventional mortgage. That's the benefit of this program. And we're solving poverty because that saving is like giving them a living wage. And I'm like, see, we're just creative. We're just turning things, you know, homelessness, more complicated, of course, there's mental illness, there's all kinds of things going on. But do we ever go and ask people, do we survey them and say, what's your life? What's actually, why are you here? Where's your home? Like a lot of people in Edmonton, homeless, are from Indigenous communities. And they're traumatized. They have intergenerational trauma from residential schools, the abuse, right? And so, yeah, and mental illness. So, you know, poverty will always be with us. But the thing is, can we find creative solutions for dealing with what seems to be an intractable issue? So that's, and I've written about this. I've studied the habitat model. I've said, I think it could be applied everywhere and very successfully.
We're down to the last 5 minutes, and I feel like Sandra has, anyway, I want to throw it open to other people. And I think the most maybe efficient way to do that is with that little raised hand thing, or actually raising your hand. Either of those things could work, and let other people ask questions here.
Sure.
I was gonna actually, so Dave Spence has got a question out
Sure.
there on the chat. Dave, you want to go ahead and ask?
Yeah, if we are to stop worshiping at the altar of gross domestic product, how important is it to conceptualize degrowth? Do we need to aim for degrowth?
Thanks, Dave. I've been kind of antithetical to the degrowth movement in ecological economics, because it's not about dissing something. It's about not something. It's about, again, if I had an alternative, to me, there's nothing wrong with GDP, because if we know why it was designed to measure the cash flow in the economy after the war, because it was important to understand that cash flow so you could tax it. That's why the British developed it and the Americans kind of perfected it. So it's like the war's long over and we still have GDP. Why don't we have a well-being index? Well, it's too complicated. We can't, you can't monetize happiness or joy. Oh, is that the reason? Okay, fine, keep your GDP and we'll just run another line next to it, like the genuine progress indicator, which is still a monetized number. But if I throw the well-being index, which is 50 indicators, some of them are subjective, people are like, well, how do you weight those? It's like, I don't know. Ask people, what's more important in your community? Which of the 50 indicators, let's ask people to weight them then. And then we have a true reflection of people's values. What's wrong with that? Nothing. Why don't you do it? Well, because GDP is just so easy to calculate. Do you know how I know how it's calculated. I know the secret recipe. I've met Colonel Saunders when I was a kid. No, I actually did. But that's a whole other story. But it's like, I know how GDP is cooked. Guess what? It's based on a survey of a few households and a few businesses. That's how and it's only done once a year, and every quarter it's forecast. Oh, so you can predict the future. Well, with a partial sample size of American households and American businesses. Right. Okay. And if I say, well, you could do a 7-minute well-being survey across the entire United States. And he went, no, thanks. It's too complicated to deal with the complexity of people's emotions. No, I don't buy it. So, degrowth? No, I'm talking about well-being, flourishing. Let's use that language. Because I'm not going to throw GDP away. It's going to be with us. It's like throwing, gross revenues it's like, no, you're not going to throw that away from the income statement, but you're going to pay attention to depreciation, right, of certain assets, because that's what Warren Buffett, I said, I always ask the question, what would Warren Buffett like to see in the US balance sheet if there was a proper balance sheet? How does he know that the value of Coca-Cola as a intellectual property is the proper valuation? Think like Warren does, and then think about how the state of Arizona should look if it had a proper balance sheet. So again, I go back to those fundamentals of accounting. What is an asset? How is it to behave? Let's commit to that accounting protocol. And then ask, why did we not count nature as an asset? Why did we treat ecological services as like, they're, can we replace pollinating bees with Sandra and a paintbrush? No. Preposterous. But then we can't value the bees. I guess not. But we need bees. Yeah. Well, you just cut down this forest and all the meadows, and you see, like, it's like an insane situation. And some people say, but Mark, what you're proposing is so complicated. You want me to measure every asset class. I'm like, yeah. I mean, why is that so complicated? And then it gets even more egregious. Do you know the creation of money, 98% is created by banks when they issue loans, and there's no balance sheet that guides the Federal Reserve? It's like, how preposterous is that? It's like, it's so ridiculous. And so, like, so I do kind of go, no, I'm not a degrowther. I'm just a well-being advocate, you know. Anyways, I don't like to, a lot of people like bristle when I challenge the degrowth thing, but it's just, again, it's about education. It's about understanding where these systems come from. You know, I point out today, you know, it's interesting, we're dealing with a currency crisis, right? And I remind people, go back to the notes of Maynard Keynes, Bretton Woods. He argued that currency should be based on natural resources. And guess what Mr. Putin is doing? And we hate his guts, right? He's bringing back, he's trying to bring back what Keynes actually argued. But who won that argument? The US won the argument. And they've dominated the debt money system for the last 80 years. And now it's running out of steam. So we got some work to do, some really creative, courageous work to do.
Mark, thank you so much. I know you have company and you want to go enjoy them. And that's an essential part of well-being. But you've really, I'm not sure I want to say you've increased our happiness. But
John Cobb's online.
Thank you so much. It's been very stimulating, and it's we will take your ideas seriously and act on them. Thank you.
Thank
Yes.
you.
Bye-bye.
And Kayla has posted in the chat the link to the survey. So I hope we'll all take a look at that, and let's get that going in Flagstaff.
Well, I want to give it a shout out to, I see John Cobb is with us, and he's the most spectacular human being, honestly.
Yeah, so
I second that emotion. Thank you.
Spectacularly late,
everyone.
I fear.
What, John?
I was spectacularly late to this program.
I'd say appropriately late. Not a problem.
No,
Nice to see
not
you.
that.
yeah, we're glad
But
to
Mark,
have you.
Mark is amazing. Whatever he touches, he does it in some different way from anybody else. And always seemingly more wisely. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, John. I would just give a shout out to you and Herman. I didn't realize Herman had passed. And, you know, I have to tell the story. It was in 2003. I had an idea that I was the head of the Canadian Ecological Economic Society, and it was the 15th anniversary for the common good. And so I boldly, cheekily asked John and Herman to come to Jasper, Alberta to be with us. And it was my favorite conference, and they were both spectacular. So
Well, we always impose on Dr. John Cobb for guidance and for introducing us to interesting, creative people like you, Mark. And one of these days, Dr. Cobb, we will ask you to come and meet our community here. Although you were here in Flagstaff about 25 years ago now, it's time that we brought you back.
I'm afraid that after these 25 years, I travel entirely by Zoom.
Yeah, well, thank you, everyone.
Zoom is amazing.
Yes, it is. I never thought I would say thank goodness for Zoom, but
I know.
and it's
I,
really-
I used to think it was wonderful if I had an audience of 1,000 people in China, and sometimes I did, you know. I have a reputation, but now I've had an audience of 1 million people in China.
oh my
Amazing.
God.
Once, I'm not suggesting all the time, but I wasn't having 1,000 people all the time before. I just mean Zoom makes possible connections.
Well, don't, we, what we can manage here in Flagstaff, but
I like talking with 5 people just as much. More fun.
All right, thanks,
Oh,
everyone.
good night, everyone.